When photographic restoration specialist Dr. Maria Hernandez began her assignment with the Vermont Historical Society, she assumed it would be a straightforward digitization effort, carefully scanning and preserving a series of early 20th century school photographs. Most of the images she had encountered so far were what one would expect from the period: neat rows of rural school children dressed in their best attire, captured in the stiff formal poses dictated by the long exposure times of early cameras. After 3 weeks of steady progress, however, she came across a 1903 photograph from Pine Ridge School in Colonia County that unsettled her in a way no other image had. At first glance, the group portrait of 23 children with their teacher appeared to be no different from the dozens she had already processed. Yet as Dr. Hernandez magnified the photograph to repair its subtle cracks and faded edges, she realized that something about this particular image was profoundly different. In her 15 years of restoring historical photographs, she would later confess to colleagues nothing had unnerved her quite like this one. The Vermont Historical Society's stately headquarters on State Street in Montpelier provided a quiet environment for her work, her restoration equipment neatly set up in a corner of the archives, where she painstakingly scanned each fragile print at high resolution. The Pine Ridge photograph initially blended into the collection, children arrayed in 3 rows before a modest wooden schoolhouse, their teacher positioned to the side. Everyone dressed with care for what was then a rare and important occasion. The expressions were serious, as was the custom of the era, reflecting both the demands of long exposure times and the prevailing belief that children should present themselves with dignity. Their clothes, while simple, were neat, their hair combed and their bodies held in the slightly rigid postures necessary for keeping still during the photographer's work. Each face conveyed a mixture of nervousness and pride, the natural tension of a generation unaccustomed to cameras. But one boy shattered that composure. Timothy Holbrook, just 12 years old, beamed with a wide, genuine grin, his head tilted back slightly and his mouth caught in the moment of laughter. Unlike the solemn expressions of his classmates, Timothy's joy seemed spontaneous, as if something had amused him at the precise instant the shutter opened. His unrestrained happiness contrasted so sharply with the grim discipline of the others that he seemed almost to exist in a different reality within the same frame. This single child's exuberance stood out so forcefully against the gravity of the group that it gave the photograph an uncanny, haunting quality, one that would linger in Dr. Hernandez's thoughts long after she finished her day's work. Timothy's placement in the middle row of the Pine Ridge School photograph seemed almost ordinary at first glance, but the longer Dr. Hernandez studied it, the more his presence unsettled her. He was flanked by 2 children who stood rigidly still, their faces as solemn as every other classmate in the frame, as though they had either failed to notice his sudden burst of amusement or had consciously chosen to ignore it. The boy's laughter looked so vivid, so alive, that it seemed impossible his companions could remain so unmoved. His appearance gave no hint of peculiarity. He wore a plain shirt with suspenders like the other boys, his hair neatly parted and combed for the occasion. Nothing in his dress or grooming explained why he had broken from the ritual seriousness of the group. At the far right of the photograph stood Miss Clara Whitman, the school teacher whose name appeared in the historical records. A woman in her 30s, her stern face and upright posture reflected the rigid discipline of early 20th century rural classrooms. She did not so much as glance in Timothy's direction. If she had noticed his laughter, her composure suggested she had chosen not to acknowledge it, a choice in keeping with the strict formality expected of teachers in that era. Yet it was not Timothy's clothes, nor the teacher's indifference that made the photograph extraordinary. It was the boy's expression itself. Unlike a staged or mischievous grin, his laughter seemed unprompted and sincere. The the kind of irrepressible joy children rarely allowed themselves in such formal circumstances. Compelled to understand what had prompted such a breach in discipline, Dr. Hernandez directed her restoration software to focus on his face. She sharpened the resolution, balanced the tones, and zoomed in until every grain of the century-old image was visible. At first, her attention lingered on the curve of his mouth and the openness of his posture. But when she examined his eyes under high magnification, she froze. The laughter that radiated from Timothy's mouth did not extend to his gaze. Instead, his eyes revealed something cold and unsettling, a sharp predatory awareness that seemed impossible for a child. The juxtaposition was jarring, his features arranged in joyous mirth, yet his eyes calculating, watchful, and devoid of innocence. In that moment, the boy's image transformed from a charming anomaly to something profoundly disturbing, as though the photograph itself were holding back a darker truth. What unsettled Dr. Hernandez most was not simply Timothy's laughter, but where his eyes were fixed. Unlike his classmates whose gazes either met the camera or drifted slightly off to one side, Timothy was staring at something beyond the edge of the frame. His eyes locked with an intensity that suggested he was watching something very specific, something that appeared to delight him in a way that chilled the viewer. With each adjustment in magnification and every pass of her enhancement software, Dr. Hernandez confirmed the same disturbing truth. His eyes betrayed not joy, but a cold, almost cruel satisfaction. The expression was entirely at odds with the cheerful openness of his mouth, creating a psychological dissonance that hinted at a darker source of amusement. It was not the laughter of a child distracted by a joke or tickled by a classmate, but the expression of someone deriving pleasure from the discomfort or pain of another. Driven by a growing sense of unease, Dr. Hernandez reached out to the Vermont Historical Society, requesting every record available concerning Pine Ridge School and its students in 1903. What had begun as a routine restoration project now felt like the opening of an investigation into something long buried. The Society's archives proved unusually thorough, preserving a detailed record of rural education from that period, including attendance logs, disciplinary files, and letters exchanged between teachers and the school board. Within those records, Timothy Holbrook's name appeared often. The attendance rolls confirmed his enrollment in 1903, noting that he was 12 years old, the son of a local farming family that had lived in Colonia County for generations. But it was the disciplinary reports that gave Dr. Hernandez pause. Teachers described Timothy as bright and quick-witted, but also deeply troubling. Early 20th century educators used formal yet revealing language labeling his behavior as displaying antisocial tendencies. More than once, his teachers noted he showed an unusual lack of empathy toward his peers, sometimes taunting younger children or responding to rules with quiet defiance. Miss Clara Whitman, the stern instructor immortalized in the photograph, submitted multiple reports in 1903 that documented her concerns. Her accounts hinted at a boy who not only resisted authority, but who seemed to take a strange satisfaction in the distress of others, echoing the same unsettling quality that Dr. Hernandez had already seen, frozen in his eyes. Miss Clara Whitman's written accounts painted a chilling portrait of Timothy Holbrook, one that went far beyond the mischievous pranks expected of a schoolboy. She described repeated incidents in which Timothy deliberately targeted younger children hiding their belongings, spreading cruel rumors, and manipulating classmates with what she called calculated malice. Perhaps the most disturbing entry came from March 1903, when Timothy devised a so-called game that required younger children to capture small animals. Instead of freeing them, he encouraged his peers to watch the animals suffer. Miss Whitman, appalled, discovered the activity and noted with horror how Timothy seemed to relish the pain he inflicted, smiling as the frightened creatures struggled. The school records also suggested that Timothy may have been involved in multiple thefts and acts of vandalism, though he was rarely caught directly. Other students whispered to teachers that Timothy laughed openly when punishments fell upon classmates for offenses they suspected he had orchestrated. This disturbing pattern of behavior reached a chilling climax on the very day the Pine Ridge School photograph was taken. That afternoon, Miss Whitman filed a detailed incident report with the school board, carefully describing the events leading up to the group portrait. According to her account, the photographer had arrived in the morning to set up his bulky equipment outside the wooden schoolhouse. As the children were shuffled into position, Timothy executed what Whitman described as a premeditated act of cruelty. He approached 8-year-old Sarah Fletcher, one of the smallest children at the school, and quietly convinced her that the photographer wanted her to stand at a very specific spot. He told her she needed to squeeze between 2 taller students in the back row to ensure she could be seen. What Sarah did not know was that Timothy had earlier dug a hole at that exact location, carefully concealing it with loose soil and scraps of grass. As Sarah obediently stepped into place, she suddenly dropped backward into the pit. Though not dangerously deep, the hole was enough to trap her, leaving her crying and struggling to climb out. The moment was chaotic. Students gasped. Miss Whitman rushed forward, and several older children scrambled to help lift Sarah out. In the midst of the confusion, Timothy stood calmly in his designated spot, his posture rigid, his smile fixed. Whitman's report emphasized what made the incident so profoundly unsettling. Unlike the other children who were horrified by Sarah's plight, Timothy betrayed no sympathy. He did not move to help, nor did he appear alarmed. Instead, he looked on with what Whitman described as a disturbing satisfaction, his amusement frozen at the precise instant the photographer captured the image. The chilling laughter immortalized in the 1903 Pine Ridge School photograph Dr. Hernandez realized was not the joy of childhood at all, but the visible trace of a boy finding pleasure in the suffering of others. Rather than showing the slightest concern for Sarah Fletcher's distress, Timothy had instead erupted into laughter, his mirth growing louder as the young girl cried in humiliation and fear. Even as her sobs echoed across the schoolyard, Timothy's amusement did not waver. The timing proved cruelly perfect. At that exact moment, the photographer, oblivious to the commotion behind the carefully posed group, triggered the shutter. The result was the infamous image, an entire class frozen in solemn dignity. While Timothy alone radiated joy, his laughter captured forever. The other children, intent on holding their formal poses, had remained still and serious, their rigid expressions masking the chaos unfolding just out of frame. By the time Miss Whitman rushed to intervene, the photograph had already been taken, and Timothy's unsettling laughter was permanently etched into history. The disciplinary records preserved at the Vermont Historical Society revealed that this incident was not an isolated occurrence, but part of a much darker pattern of behavior. Over the course of 1903, Miss Whitman documented with meticulous care the many ways Timothy targeted vulnerable classmates, using his sharp intelligence to torment rather than uplift. Her reports described him as a boy who excelled at psychological manipulation, capable of pinpointing the unique fears of each child and exploiting them with ruthless precision. One report from February 1903 described how Timothy convinced 6-year-old Emma Watson that her parents intended to send her away to an orphanage because she was not performing well in her lessons. He embellished the story with chilling details about orphanage life, inventing tales of neglect and cruelty that left the little girl in constant terror. Emma endured weeks of fear before Miss Whitman uncovered the truth and reassured her. Another account from April of that year described how Timothy had destroyed the painstakingly made projects of several younger students. Though he left no direct evidence of his involvement, his satisfaction was unmistakable as he quietly watched the younger children break down in tears over their ruined work. Miss Whitman's reports also revealed Timothy's uncanny ability to manipulate adult perceptions. When under direct supervision, he presented himself as courteous, diligent, even helpful. But the moment oversight lapsed, he revealed his darker nature. He seemed to take particular delight in choosing victims too timid or too young to seek justice, ensuring his cruelty went unchallenged. Again and again, Whitman emphasized that Timothy's pleasure did not stem from childish pranks, but from a deeper, more sinister satisfaction at watching others suffer. Most alarming of all, her notes revealed a clear escalation. Each incident was not only more cruel than the last, but also more carefully executed, as though Timothy were honing his methods. What began as small deceptions and petty vandalism had grown into elaborate schemes of emotional torment, culminating in the calculated humiliation of Sarah Fletcher on the very day of the school photograph. For Miss Whitman, it was a deeply troubling progression, evidence that the boy's cruelty was not fading with discipline, but evolving with dangerous intent. Each incident Miss Whitman recorded showed a disturbing progression in Timothy's behavior. What began as petty cruelties had evolved into increasingly elaborate and psychologically devastating schemes, as though he were refining his methods with each new act. By the time of the infamous school photograph, his cruelty had reached its most public and permanent expression, preserved forever in what should have been a symbol of community pride and educational achievement. Instead, the image revealed the chilling truth of a boy who found delight in the suffering of others. As Dr. Hernandez pursued her investigation, she turned her attention to the Holbrook family itself. Searching through courthouse files, church archives, and county records for clues that might explain the roots of Timothy's disturbing nature, the documents she uncovered painted a picture of a household steeped in harshness, discipline, and cruelty. Timothy's father, Samuel Holbrook, was a farmer of some standing in Colonia County, owning several hundred acres near Pine Ridge. On paper, he appeared successful, but community reports revealed a much darker reputation. Known as one of the strictest and most severe men in the region, Samuel was feared for his brutal treatment of both hired laborers and livestock. Farmers and neighbors alike spoke of his relentless demands, describing him as a man who seemed to value domination above all else. Church records from the local Methodist congregation indicated that the Holbrook household had long been a subject of quiet concern. Ministers noted whispered reports from neighbors about excessive discipline within the family. Some families even claimed to have heard disturbing sounds, shouts, cries, and the unmistakable noises of beatings emanating from the Holbrook property. More troubling still, county records revealed that Samuel had come under investigation in 1902 for allegations of animal cruelty. Several witnesses described watching him torment farm animals in ways that went far beyond accepted farming practices. Acts carried out not for necessity, but for his own grim amusement. Though the case never resulted in formal charges due to the difficulty of gathering sufficient evidence, the testimonies consistently emphasized Samuel's visible enjoyment of the pain he inflicted, especially when others were present to witness it. In contrast, Timothy's mother, Martha, appeared almost spectral in the records, a passive, cowed woman who rarely interfered with her husband's behavior. Church leaders suggested she lived in constant fear of Samuel's temper and had learned silence as a means of self-preservation. Her inability or unwillingness to shield her children likely left them exposed to the full force of Samuel's cruelty. The environment in which Timothy was raised thus offered a grim blueprint for his own developing tendencies. His father's dominance and sadism provided a model of power exercised through fear and suffering. while his mother's passivity reinforced the idea that cruelty could be enacted without consequence. For a boy as intelligent and observant as Timothy, the lesson was unmistakable. Inflicting pain was not only acceptable, but also a source of entertainment and control. In such an atmosphere, cruelty was not an aberration. It was the language of authority itself. Timothy's behavior at Pine Ridge School was not an isolated problem confined to the classroom walls, but a direct extension of the lessons he had absorbed at home, where power was defined by cruelty and dominance. What Miss Clara Whitman had observed in her reports, the calculated pranks, the psychological torment, the predatory enjoyment, was simply the reflection of the broader philosophy instilled in him by his father. As Dr. Hernandez dug deeper into the historical records, she uncovered evidence that Timothy's cruelty extended far beyond the schoolyard, affecting nearly every facet of community life in rural Colonia County. Community records from 1903 and 1904 painted a troubling picture of a boy whose reputation had already begun to spread through the farms and villages of the region. Families documented growing fears about Timothy's behavior toward their children and livestock, while the Methodist Church kept minutes of congregational meetings where parents voiced their concerns. The notes described children who became reluctant to attend Sunday gatherings or community festivals whenever they knew Timothy would be present, their dread reflecting the same anxiety Miss Whitman had reported in the classroom. One especially alarming account came from the Harvest Festival of October 1903. During the celebration, Timothy had lured several younger children into participating in a so-called game that involved trapping small animals in crude enclosures and then frightening them to provoke panicked reactions. When horrified parents discovered the children engaged in this activity, they were struck not only by their distress, but also by Timothy's overt satisfaction in orchestrating their fear. To him, the suffering of both animals and children seemed to provide the same dark amusement. Local business owners, too, had grown wary of Timothy. Store records showed he had been banned from multiple shops after incidents of theft and vandalism. In several cases, he cleverly manipulated situations so that blame fell on other children, leaving his victims punished while he maintained an appearance of innocence. These patterns began to erode the sense of trust and solidarity that normally defined a close-knit farming community. Families became cautious, restricting their children's movements, avoiding gatherings, and carrying an unease that was unusual for such a rural setting. Perhaps most damning were the letters exchanged between Miss Whitman and the school board during 1903. In them, the teacher made repeated pleas for Timothy's removal, insisting that his presence was undermining education and causing measurable harm to other children. She detailed instances where students developed anxiety, fear, and reluctance to attend class, all directly linked to Timothy's abuse and manipulation. Yet despite her thorough documentation, the board resisted. The Holbrook family's local prominence, coupled with the difficulty of proving Timothy's guilt in incidents often hidden behind his facade of innocence, led to hesitation and inaction. But Timothy's escalating behavior soon reached a point where the community could no longer look away. Dr. Hernandez's research revealed that in 1904, just a year after the haunting school photograph was taken, Timothy became involved in an incident so severe that it forced local authorities to act decisively. For the first time, his cruelty crossed a threshold that the protection of family influence and lack of evidence could not shield him from setting the stage for the reckoning that followed. In the spring of 1904, Timothy Holbrook's escalating cruelty culminated in an act that finally forced the community to confront the threat he posed. County records revealed that he had been caught deliberately poisoning a neighbor's livestock with toxic substances stolen from his father's farm. The attack was devastating. Several valuable animals died, inflicting significant financial loss on the affected family. What made the crime especially chilling was not only the outcome, but the careful calculation behind it. Timothy had spent weeks observing the animal's feeding patterns, planning the timing of the poisoning, so that the maximum damage would occur all at once. Witnesses later recalled seeing him near the neighbor's property, watching the stricken animals with what they described as visible satisfaction. His fascination disturbingly similar to the expression captured in the Pine Ridge School photograph. This time the evidence was undeniable. Unlike the pranks and manipulations of the schoolyard, the livestock poisoning left a clear trail that implicated Timothy directly. County authorities charged him with destruction of property and animal cruelty offenses serious enough to carry the possibility of placement in a reform school. Yet, once again, the Holbrook family's prominence shielded him from the full weight of justice. His father Samuel leveraged both wealth and influence to negotiate an alternative arrangement. Rather than face formal prosecution, Timothy was quietly removed from Vermont and sent to live with a distant relative in Massachusetts. Local newspaper accounts from 1904 mentioned the boy's sudden departure, only briefly cloaking the truth in euphemism. Articles referred to educational opportunities and family decisions, omitting any mention of criminal charges or the suffering left in his wake. To the outside world, it appeared as though Timothy had simply been granted a chance for advancement elsewhere. While the reality was far darker, a community relieved to be rid of him, but unwilling to publicly acknowledge the cause. For Pine Ridge School, his absence was transformative. Miss Clara Whitman's final reports documented a rapid and dramatic improvement in the atmosphere of her classroom. Students who had once been anxious and withdrawn began to participate openly again, freed from the constant threat of Timothy's psychological torment. The vandalism, thefts, and calculated acts of cruelty that had plagued the school ceased almost immediately. Yet the damage lingered. Whitman noted that several of Timothy's former victims required months of reassurance before they felt safe enough to fully engage with their peers, a sobering reminder of the deep scars left by his presence. Dr. Hernandez, piecing these fragments together over a century later, reached a chilling conclusion. The 1903 Pine Ridge School photograph was not simply a record of rural education. It was the haunting preservation of a moment when a 12-year-old boy's calculated cruelty had achieved its desired effect. Timothy Holbrook's broad, unsettling laughter, frozen forever in that image, was the visible manifestation of his delight in Sarah Fletcher's humiliation. What appeared at first to be the innocent joy of childhood was in truth the dark triumph of a predator in the making. The Pine Ridge School photograph ultimately stood as documentary proof of childhood cruelty that transcended ordinary misbehavior or the typical challenges of development. Timothy Holbrook's unsettling expression revealed something far more sinister, a deliberate malice and disturbing satisfaction in the suffering of others. Signs of a psychological abnormality that left unchecked would almost certainly persist into adulthood. What Dr. Hernandez uncovered was not merely a story about a single boy, but a broader indictment of the environment that allowed his behavior to flourish. Her research showed how the rural Vermont community, unwilling to challenge the Holbrook family's social standing and economic influence, had repeatedly chosen silence over intervention. This reluctance created an atmosphere in which Timothy could victimize children with near impunity, honing his manipulation of both peers and adults. It became a case study in how intelligent children with antisocial tendencies can skillfully exploit perception, presenting themselves as innocent or helpful when watched closely while secretly tormenting those too vulnerable to defend themselves. Protected by privilege and overlooked by those unwilling to act, Timothy's cruelty endured far longer than it should have. What made the photograph extraordinary was how it preserved in a single frozen moment the unmasking of Timothy's true nature. To the casual observer, it might have seemed no more than a rare burst of laughter in a solemn school portrait. Yet under Dr. Hernandez's careful restoration, the truth emerged. The cold gleam in Timothy's eyes betrayed the predator beneath the surface of childhood innocence. The dissonance between his broad, joyful grin and the chilling intent in his gaze encapsulated the danger of ignoring cruelty in its formative stages. His expression embodied the psychology of someone who had already learned to derive pleasure from suffering, and who would, if unchecked, continue to seek opportunities to inflict harm throughout his life. As Dr. Hernandez prepared her final report for the Vermont Historical Society, she reflected on the unsettling revelation that advanced restoration techniques had unearthed. A century-old image intended to document community spirit and educational pride had instead become evidence of how evil can manifest in the unlikeliest of forms. More than a historical artifact, the photograph was a warning, a reminder that cruelty thrives in environments where reputation outweighs accountability, and where protecting appearances is valued more than shielding the vulnerable. It demonstrated that the most dangerous predators are not always those who stand apart, but often those who learn to hide behind the familiar mask of innocence, their laughter concealing the darkness beneath.